Welcome back to App Stories. Today's episode is brought to you by Memberful, Jam, and Notion. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Vitici. Hi, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
Oh, I'm cold. I'm cold here in North Carolina. We had a little bit of a cold snap overnight. It got down to freezing, but I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
Well, I'm happy because one of your other podcasts, your other podcast has joined Mac Stories.
That's right. Ruminate has joined Mac Stories. This is a show that I've been doing with Rob Knight since 2015. It's really, it predates my time at Mac Stories by a little bit, by a few months.
And what is Ruminate? Like, give App Stories listeners, like, why should they subscribe for Ruminate? I mean, besides listening to even more of your excellent podcasting voice.
Of course. Well, Ruminate is all about the weird web. I mean, Rob and I have been talking for years.
Good enough as a pitch for me.
Yeah, it's all about, it's about cool projects that we find on the web. I mean, Rob by trade is a web developer, and I'm a very online person. And so we're always,
yes, you are.
We're always checking in each other's notes about the kinds of things that we're using. So, topics like content moderation on the web and crazy projects that Rob is building for Alfred or for his website. All those things are things we talk about all the time. Plus oddball snacks. We compare strange snacks. There are a lot of strange snacks in the UK, and there are a lot of them in America. So we have a good time talking about strange snacks and the occasional video game because we can't help ourselves. We love the video games, but it really is a first and foremost kind of internet web-based show all about what's going on with the Fediverse and ActivityPub and changes that we're seeing with the demise of centralized services like Twitter and other social media platforms. So it's about that. It's about the indie web more than anything else. So
nice.
Yeah, check it out. If you haven't listened to Ruminate before, you haven't come across it, it's worth giving it a shot. The last couple of episodes I think have been particularly good ones, and we'll be coming out with it every other Tuesday in the afternoon. So that's the same schedule we've been doing for years now, and it'll continue on Mac Stories, and you'll see the posts when we have a new episode posted on Mac Stories.
Yeah, so people can go to macstories.net/ruminate to find details about the show and all the links to sign up, as well as to, they can go to the brand new or updated Mac Stories podcasts page. That's macstories.net/podcasts, where you can find our expanding lineup of shows with App Stories, Unwind, Magic Rays of Light, and now, of course, Ruminate.
Yes, exactly. And I'll put a link in the show notes to the introductory post, the announcing the Ruminate coming to Mac Stories, because it was kind of fun writing the backstory of Ruminate. I talked a little bit about the origins of the show that date back to 2015.
Yeah. We need one more, I think, at this point, and people will have a Mac Stories show every day of the week, I believe.
There you go. That's a good idea.
I think we need one more. I think we need one more, though. So we need to. We are at 4. So if you want to fill from Monday to Friday, we still need another one, John.
We're going to have to look into that. We'll have to look into it. All right, Federico, during the pre-show today for App Stories Plus subscribers, we talked all about Mac Stories Inc., kind of the business and what we're doing. Why is it that we're doing all these podcasts? Why are we joining forces with all these different people, new writers, all kinds of things are happening at Mac Stories these days. And we talked a little bit about that because it's not something that we talk about very often, but we figured we've probably raised enough questions in people's minds that it was time to address it a little bit. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, you can go to appstories.plus to subscribe to the show that way. Or you can become a Club Premier member, which is part of Club Mac Stories. That App Stories Plus is one of the many perks that include our Discord community server, special columns by Federico and me, and a bunch of other things. Just go to plus.club to learn more about a Club Premier membership. All right, Federico, it's time for our somewhat annual Shortcuts Wishlist episode.
Somewhat annual because we didn't do one last year.
No, I think it was kind of, we talked about it, but we talked about it more in the context of like WWDC and things going on earlier in the spring, and we didn't really get into the nitty-gritty of it. I think we probably covered it a little bit during last year's Automation April.
Yeah. Which, speaking of which, so we didn't do a shortcuts wish list episode last year. We did one. We did it in 2021, 2022, and we skipped this
Right.
episode last year. And the reason it's pretty simple. Look, the shortcuts app hasn't really changed much over the past couple of years.
Right.
And so the first thing I want to share is that this year we're gonna take a pause with Automation April. There's not going to be Automation April 2024, and the reason is pretty simple. We struggled last year in terms of evaluating shortcuts from people because the shortcuts app hasn't changed much over the past couple of years. And it was a challenge with last year's edition to separate shortcuts that had already been submitted the year before from the new ones.
Right.
And shortcuts has continued to not change, unfortunately, in 2023. And at this point, we're pretty much looking at the same app as it was in 2022, save for some additions, some new actions here and there, but really just more bugs and more technical issues, as we'll discuss shortly. So we've decided we're going to take a pause this year, especially in light of the rumors of brand new AI features coming in iOS 18, and maybe that will mean that shortcuts will also be part of the picture there. Maybe there will be some changes to shortcuts finally, but for that reason, we'll be taking a pause from Automation April in 2024, and this is why we are rediscussing once again what we want to see from shortcuts in the future, with the hope that there's going to be Automation April 2025 and that the following items that we will discuss in our wish list will be finally addressed.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Memberful. Memberful is best-in-class membership software used by the web's biggest creators, publishers, and media companies, including us here at Mac Stories. If you're building a membership website for a client, Memberful handles all the hard stuff so you don't have to, and then you can complete your builds quickly, and your clients can go on with creating content while earning revenue with ease. Memberful protects members-only content and allows site owners to select which subscribers get access to protected areas of your website using server-side content protection. It seamlessly integrates with WordPress and features a host of shortcodes and built-in WordPress functions so that you can insert dynamic links and integrate Memberful data into your WordPress theme. Plus, Memberful has built-in connections with popular tools like MailChimp, Discord, and Google Analytics, so site owners can reach and monetize their existing audience without rebuilding their entire tech stack. Also, with Memberful, your clients will always have full control and ownership of their audience and their brand, which is very important. Plus, they maintain a GraphQL API, webhooks, and OAuth single sign-on to make integrating even easier. Memberful has everything your client will need to run a membership program, including streamlined and powerful checkout, an easy-to-use member portal, transactional email, and a member management dashboard. Memberful's analytics give your clients an easy-to-use, in-depth view of what's working, what's not, and where to double down. Help your clients monetize their passion. Get started for free at memberful.com/appstories. That's memberful.com/appstories. Our thanks to Memberful for their support of the show. I got to say that I kind of feel the same hesitation I did last year about talking about a wish list because my greatest wish really is for stable shortcuts.
Yes.
I think one of the things that I've found myself doing over the last year plus is not that I'm using shortcuts necessarily less. I still use it in a lot of parts of the work that I do, but I'm very consciously building simpler shortcuts because I feel like there are too many places in the app right now where things break down. And the more actions and the more fancy you try to get with a shortcut, the more opportunities there are for those bugs that we'll talk about to kind of creep in and bring everything to a crashing halt. So a lot of times, just kind of conceptually, if I have something that maybe I could have made this into a many step long shortcut, I'll break it apart and I'll use it in chunks because that way I feel like I'm less likely to have to. It's easier to find the problems and then easier to fix them and less likely that it's going to disrupt my day-to-day work.
Yeah, boy, do I have thoughts on this one. So the thing is, I still use shortcuts a lot. Like I
Right.
rely on shortcuts for so many aspects of my workflow on a daily basis. But the problem is that the more I rely on shortcuts, the more bugs continue to accumulate over the years. And I think it's become especially problematic with the latest releases of iOS 17.4 and macOS Sonoma 14.4.
Mhm.
So many parts of the Shortcuts app are broken for me right now. And these are the worst part is that these are performance issues and visual glitches and bugs that happen sometimes. And you know that when a bug happens sometimes, that is the most challenging thing to figure out. But I wrote in my review of iOS and iPadOS 17 in September that the Shortcuts app is Apple's buggiest piece of software. And if any other major Apple app like Safari or Notes or FaceTime was as buggy as Shortcuts, the press would only talk about those issues. And I think it's kind of wild that Shortcuts is in such a buggy state. And, I guess it goes to show that, maybe not that many people rely on Shortcuts like we do, but you wouldn't expect those kinds of problems from an app like Safari or Mail or Reminders.
Right, right.
Um, and to give you an example, like for example, I'm working on a major update to my Apple Frames shortcut. I'm working on Apple Frames 3.2, and I'm trying to work on it on a Mac because, typically working with the Mac version, it used to be the most stable version of shortcuts to scroll, in the editor, shortcuts that have tons of actions. Now, however, I'm finding that in Sonoma 14.4, every time I perform, like for every single interaction, and by interaction, I mean scrolling the editor or clicking a button or selecting some text in the shortcuts editor. Every interaction means I see a beach ball for a few
Yeah,
seconds.
yeah.
It's I am struggling to finish, in finishing this update because it's taking me forever because the app keeps beach balling in front of me with the latest version of Sonoma. But there's more. Sometimes, for whatever reason, the app doesn't like to save a text file to Finder or the Files app. So sometimes on my iPhone, if I have a shortcut that has an action that runs another shortcut, sometimes it just gets stuck and it
Yeah,
gets stuck
yeah.
forever in the dynamic island and it doesn't go away. And I have to reboot my phone for the shortcut to become unstuck. Um, there was another bug that I discovered last week, and I believe Apple is aware of this one. Um, I was making a shortcut on my iPad, and then I was syncing that shortcut obviously to the Mac thanks to iCloud. And I realized that on the Mac, Shortcuts was swapping one of my actions from a third party app with another action from a different third party app without telling me. And it turns out that Shortcuts doesn't have any safeguards in place if a third party app provides an action that has a name. In this case, the name was transform text. And
Mhm.
because another third-party app had an action called transform text, shortcuts kept swapping between them. Now, not only is that a pretty problematic bug, but it's also a pretty serious security risk, right? Because you are
Sure.
invisibly swapping an action from a third-party app with another.
Right.
And if you don't know what you're doing, you're basically, and if you're just clicking OK on the security prompts, you're now sending your data to an app that you may not be expect to receive data.
Right.
And I believe that thankfully Apple is aware of this one and they're looking into it. But it just goes to show that it just feels it's felt this way for a long time that Shortcuts was built on a creaky foundation. But as time has gone on, that has only gotten worse. And I think, I was writing about these problems in September, and it was a pretty rough section of my review. And believe me, it's gotten worse.
Right, right. No, you're absolutely right, and to me, especially that one with the swapping actions, it's remarkable to me because that makes it sound as though an action doesn't have some kind of unique ID. It's literally just a
Just
string
the
of
name.
text, right? It's just a name, which if that's how it works, that's kind of surprising to me. But yeah, it is rough. I had one just the other day that I think I told you about where I have a personal action where if I put my iPhone on a charger and my presence sensor from a car in my office happens to detect that I'm in that room, that means I'm sitting at my desk, which means turn on standby right away. Lock the screen and then it goes right into standby. And it stopped working. And I thought, all right, well, I got a little time right now. I'm going to try to fix this. Every time I tapped on the shortcut to edit it, it just crashed the app. And I finally got through to it on the Mac. And I still don't know what was wrong with it. I think I'm just going to have to rebuild it because something went wrong. Maybe it was when I was changing some of my network setup and how the Akara is connected to the home app or something. But there's no it points to one of the problems that I think that goes beyond bugs, which is like error messaging. There are error messages in shortcuts, but they're almost always kind of meaningless. I mean, I can't make heads or tails of most of them. And so you don't really have much to go on other than something broke, on this particular action or something like that. So it is tough. And I think that it's gone on for so long now that it's really hard to look at it and not become pessimistic. And I try not to be that way. I try to
I
be
tried the
optimistic.
same, yeah.
But the problem is that it really, we're not talking about a 2024 issue or a
No,
2023 issue. We're
no.
talking about problems, and some of these bugs date back years. I mean, you see people posting about this on Mastodon and things, the such and such bug has not been fixed since, it appeared in 2021 or 2022. It's a problem. And that really needs to be more than anything, I think, the focus of any updates this year.
Yeah. So yeah, stability, bug fixes, and at some point you have to wonder, maybe is it the foundation of the shortcut app? Is it Swift UI the problem? Is it something else? We don't know. But my first item in the wish list is for sure bug fixes and performance improvements, just stability all around.
Yeah, I will say too, Federico, before we move on, is that one of the things that I did that helped things a lot was I deleted dozens of shortcuts. And
Yeah, that
that's not a
helps with
good
sync,
yeah,
but it's not a good
that's
solution.
it's not a good solution. It works for a lot of things, and I don't even know. I mean, because one of the problems, and we didn't even cover this, is that shortcuts like to pop out of their folders. I have shortcuts that pop out of their folders
Oh
all
yeah,
the
all the
time,
time, all
all
the
the
time.
time. And I'm pretty sure it's some kind of sync issue that's not quite right between different devices, and you happen to open something and it pops out of the folder. But yeah, getting rid of a lot of old shortcuts really helped me a lot. But I don't know. That's really that's like saying stop using the app as much and it'll work better for you. I mean, that's not a good solution.
You can't break it if you don't use it, right? That's
Right,
some
exactly.
big brain strategy going on there.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Jam. If you're a web developer and you work on a team, you'll know sometimes your teammates send you bug reports with very little context, like maybe just a text description with no screenshots, console logs, or user ID. And instead of fixing it, you have to go to the person who made the ticket and hunt down the right information, or go back and forth over weeks in the ticket comments to find out if it was a local storage API, the response from a network request, cookies at the time zone you're in, and it just ends up being frustrating trying to figure out what went wrong. You might have heard of Jam. It's used by more than 90,000 people. That's because it's a free tool that saves web developers and designers a ton of time and frustration. It ensures that your teammates make perfect bug reports every time. They literally can't do it wrong. It automatically includes a video of the bug, console logs, network requests, and the information you'll need to debug, like even what their internet speed is. It even automatically lists the steps to reproduce the bug. It's also super easy to get your teammates to use because it's just a Chrome extension. When they see a bug, they just click the button right away and it creates a ticket in your issue tracker. So it saves time for them and it saves you a lot of hopping on calls and meetings to debug. If you're a web developer and you would rather spend your time writing code than responding to comments in your issue tracker, send your team to jam.dev. That's jam.dev, or just click the link in the show notes. Our thanks to Jam for their support of the show.
All right, let me tackle some of the easy stuff from
All
my
right.
wish
All right.
list. On the Mac,
Yes.
personal automations. There should be personal automations on Mac OS. I can't believe that we still don't. It's been what, 2 years since shortcuts arrived on the Mac? 3 years
Three
even?
years. 3 years.
Three,
Yeah.
almost 3 years. We're going into
I
the
think.
third
Yeah.
year of shortcuts on Mac OS, and shortcuts on the Mac was announced in grand style as the future of automation on the Mac. And I think it's so ironic that the future of automation on the Mac doesn't have the automation feature still.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, what else is there to say, right? I know that we've had our there have been some third-party utilities pop up on macOS over the years to allow you to run shortcuts on a schedule. I've used and I can recommend the excellent Lingon X, for example.
Right.
But really, my automations, my personal automations, first of all, they should sync between devices and they should be available on macOS. They should be available on macOS with new triggers, with new options that take advantage of the open nature of macOS. I can't believe that we still don't have this functionality on the Mac.
No, especially when the Mac is more likely to be a device that's truly on 24/7 and running. I mean,
Yeah.
it makes sense for people who have desktop Macs to have that. And I think that, you know, I wrote long ago about wondering whether Apple was relying too heavily on legacy automation systems and incorporating them into shortcuts. And I think that I was maybe right about that because there are a lot of system level things that have not entered into the action library for the Mac that I think ought to be added. I mean, the Mac shortcuts library hasn't really changed in any kind
Yeah.
of meaningful way since it was introduced. Yeah, there have been bug fixes. There was, you know, the share menu was added. There have been a handful of actions added each year, but it's been very minor, even minor in comparison to what I would say was a pretty anemic additions to both, you know, iOS and iPadOS. The Mac is really just kind of languishing in third place at this point.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we should also make an item in our wish list more Mac first features.
Right.
Like there should be more Mac specific integrations for shortcuts that take advantage of the platform. Like let me customize what's in my menu bar. Let me have automations that maybe change my desktop or something like more Mac OS first functionalities in shortcuts. Speaking of automations, my next item is also something that I have mentioned on and off over the years. I would love to have third party automation triggers.
Oh, yeah.
So, conditions to run personal automations based on events and triggers that happen inside third party apps. Let me run an automation when I check off a task in Things or Todoist. Let me run an automation when I export a photo from Photomator. Let me run an automation when I mark a post as favorite in Ivory. You get the idea.
Yep.
Open up the Trigger API for third party developers so that third party developers can come in and say, I want to provide you shortcuts with a list of supported triggers so that when a compatible event takes place inside of my app, the user can put together an automation based on that third-party trigger. I think that would be an excellent addition that would also play to the strengths of the shortcuts ecosystem, which is the third-party apps.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I want to pick my next thing to be debugging tools because we already talked
Ah,
a little
yes.
bit, you know, we talked a little bit about error messages. And I know that Alex Hay, before he passed away, was working on a logging system for
Yeah.
shortcuts.
Logger,
And
excellent utility.
yeah, it's an excellent utility that really should be made by Apple and should be, you know, deeply integrated with shortcuts itself because I'm sure there are things that Apple could do with that that a third-party developer could not. And right now, it's very difficult to do any kind of debugging other than literally just pulling parts of a shortcut out and kind of testing them as units as a separate shortcut. It would be nice to be able to do things like, you know, turn blocks of actions on and off, have a logger, those kind of things, you know, just basic debugging tools that would be familiar to any developer.
Yeah, this is something that I've wished for a long time. Like any debugging tool, like for example, let me pause an action
That
as a
too, right?
shortcut runs, and let me inspect the input and the expected output. Like
Right.
let me color code. Like literally any debugging tool inspired by Xcode or Swift Playgrounds would come a long way, I think.
Instead, I find myself doing things like throwing in show results,
Yep.
actions,
Show alert.
or
Yeah.
alert or
Quick
whatever,
look
right?
preview. Like all this
Right.
doesn't the editorial and Pythonista 10 years ago had better debugging tools than Shortcuts has today. And
Wow. Wow.
that says a lot.
It really does. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Notion. There are no shortages of helpful AI tools out there, but using them means switching back and forth between yet another digital tool. So instead of simplifying your workflow, it becomes more complicated. Unless, of course, you're using Notion. I've been using Notion for a couple of years now, and it's fantastic for a small team or even a big team. It really works to any size. We're a relatively small team at Mac Stories, and we use it for things like developer documentation and working on projects that involve multiple people. It's really simple to create task lists, notes, and search everything. And then with Notion AI, you can easily do things like summarize those notes and pull out those tasks, making things really simple to move projects forward. Notion combines your notes, docs, and projects into one space that's simple and beautifully designed. You can save time and write faster by letting Notion AI handle your first draft, jumpstart a brainstorm session, or turn your messy notes into something polished. You can even automate tedious tasks like summarizing meeting notes or finding next steps. Notion AI does all of this and more and frees you up to do the deep work. The fully integrated Notion AI helps you work faster, write better, and think bigger, doing tasks that normally take you hours in just seconds. And it's used by over half the Fortune 500 companies. And teams with Notion send less email, cancel more meetings, and save time searching for their work, which reduces spending on tools and helps keep everyone on the same page. Try Notion for free when you go to notion.com/appstories. That's all lowercase letters, notion.com/app stories to try the powerful, easy to use Notion AI today. And with our link, you'll be supporting our show. That's notion.com/app stories. Our thanks to Notion for their support of the show.
My next item is going to be let me integrate shortcuts with apps natively on iOS and iPadOS. And what I mean is on the iPhone and iPad, third-party apps should be able to natively invoke and run a shortcut in the background just like they can on macOS. So on macOS, utilities like Raycast or Better Touch Tool or
Right.
Alfred or Keyboard Maestro, like you name it, all these apps, they can run one of your shortcuts in the background because there is a shortcuts API that lets third-party Mac apps get a shortcut and run it. On iOS and iPadOS, you can do it, but you do it with a URL scheme that launches the Shortcuts app in front of you and runs the shortcut. That API doesn't exist on the iPhone and iPad. And we have seen this limitation firsthand at Mac Stories because our plugin for Obsidian, the Obsidian Shortcuts Launcher, it's a free plugin that anybody can download from the Obsidian Community Plugins database. It behaves differently on macOS than iOS. On the Mac, Obsidian Shortcuts Launcher can run a shortcut in the background because there's an API, there's a shell command to run a shortcut without launching the Shortcuts app. But if you run that plugin on iOS and iPadOS, it takes you out of Obsidian, launches shortcuts with a URL scheme, and then runs the shortcut for you. And I think this API should be available on iOS and iPadOS, especially if developers developers should be able to pre-build a shortcut for you. Imagine if Carrot Weather came with Imagine like the app shortcuts, right? Apps can now provide you with this like single action shortcuts. They're called app shortcuts.
Right.
But imagine if the Carrot Weather developer could bundle a more advanced shortcut inside Carrot Weather. And imagine if you could run that shortcut natively from Carrot Weather without having to do the whole dance of installing the shortcut and running it from a widget or from a URL scheme. Like, this integration wouldn't just be for power users like us, it would also benefit third-party developers with an optional ability to bundle custom shortcuts inside of their apps.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds great. Yeah, another thing that I would like is something that I think you've talked about in the past, which is collapsible and color-coded sections in my
Mhm.
shortcuts, because it really doesn't take much to get a shortcut that's long enough that scrolling becomes a chore, especially on smaller screens, of course, like the iPhone. And being able to color code your if blocks and things like that would go a long way to making it clear what parts of a shortcut you're working in, and then being able to collapse them would be a nice way to get them out of the way where you don't have to look at them if you're not working on that section, and also help avoid errors like accidentally dragging and dropping something into the middle of an if block that you didn't mean to do because the scrolling was janky or something. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why you would like to be able to do that. And I guess another thing that goes along with this is I've always wanted to be able to lock down blocks of a shortcut and even a final shortcut, just lock it so it can't be altered, because that way I know that if I go in there to look at it, I'm not going to inadvertently do something that damages the shortcut when I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing. I can just kind of look through the code and use it as an example and not worry about doing something to edit the code.
Yeah. All right, let's see what's next in my list. These are the things that I've also mentioned before. Feature parity between platforms. Like, I think this is just a given. Like we mentioned, for example, personal automations don't exist on the Mac, but it also goes the other way around.
Yeah.
There are Mac actions that don't exist on iPadOS, for example. Why is it that on iPadOS, there's Stage Manager, like on the Mac, but there's no actions to find windows and operate window management? Like we have on macOS, the find window action, the move window action. You can work with windows on macOS using shortcuts. You cannot do the same with shortcuts on iPadOS. So I think, the window management, broadly speaking, this idea of more feature parity between versions of shortcuts. And I get it that one of Apple's prerogatives is always like to address the unique traits of each platform. But at the same time, I think what makes the Apple ecosystem great is that the same feature is pretty much available everywhere, right?
Right.
You can edit a photo in the Photos app for iPhone, and if you pick up the Photos app on the Mac, you pretty much can know your way around already. And I think that feature parity should also exist in shortcuts as much as possible, and definitely more than it exists today.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I think one thing that falls right into that category is quick actions for the Files app
Also a
in
good example. Yeah,
right,
yeah.
right, because Files has never been nearly as robust as the Finder, and Apple's done a lot to change that with ways to sort and different kinds of filtering mechanisms in the Files app, but quick actions is something that I find really handy on the Mac, and it's unfortunate that all you've really got with Files is the share sheet.
Yeah. I want to mention the fact that I think more settings should be controllable from shortcuts. For example, I realized recently that sometimes when I'm using my MacPad or when I'm streaming using PlayStation Remote Play, it's best if I disable the Wi-Fi 6E connection on my iPad Pro. So
Mhm.
it's sometimes I need to toggle off the 6 gigahertz band and just use the 5 gigahertz band, like regular Wi-Fi 6 instead of 6E.
Right.
And now that's a setting that I need to manually adjust in the settings app, and it doesn't have a corresponding action in the Shortcuts app. Now, Apple has done a pretty good job here over the years, bringing more and more settings from the settings app as toggles in shortcuts, but they need to do more, and they need to do more and more quickly. Like, I think it should become a policy inside Apple to say when we ship a new setting, there should be a corresponding shortcuts action in the shortcuts app. And so, more, again, feature parity, but between the settings app and shortcuts.
Yeah, well, I think they should have the same policy with any new app that comes out
Yeah, well,
because there's things like the sports app and the journal app
journal
and
that they
the
don't have
journal.
any. They don't have any shortcuts actions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that both of those should have them. I mean, you should be able to use a shortcut to start a live activity of your favorite sports team or to check the score or whatever it is. I mean,
Let me say. Let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a provocative question.
okay.
Is shortcuts inside Apple the iPad of Apple apps?
Yeah, I think maybe it might be. It
You
just
know what I
doesn't
mean?
quite. Yeah, I know. It's on a lot of levels, but it's like it's just not getting the love and
And what
attention.
does it say about me specifically as a person that I
don't know,
invested so
Federico.
much into both?
Oh,
Because I'm
oh,
now seeing the pattern. Like, as we are recording this episode, I am now seeing the pattern, right?
yeah,
Between shortcuts
yeah.
and the iPad.
You're a fan of the misfit. That's what you are. You're
I'm a fan of the underdog.
yes, you are.
Oh, well.
Oh
What you
man.
got for me next, John? Because then I got a big one.
So I think we should talk a little bit about your notion of how shortcuts could be integrated with AI and how there have
Okay.
been rumors of AI coming to iOS 18 because I think it's a really interesting idea. I think it is a natural way and direction for automation to go. I'm not convinced it's a this year thing though, because I don't feel like Apple is necessarily far enough down the road on its AI stuff to really do it. But what kind of things are you thinking about there?
So I really feel like this is the next big item for shortcuts. If Apple is still believing in shortcuts,
Mhm.
and if it's not like iPad OS, so I think one of the things that Apple has struggled with over the years is introducing people to the Shortcuts app. Now they have tried with different initiatives, right? They have tried with the Shortcuts Gallery, they have tried with integration with Siri, and then with app shortcuts. They have tried a bunch of things to sort of ease the learning curve for shortcuts while still maintaining the advanced capabilities for shortcuts power users. But the thing is, I get this comment from so many people being like, shortcuts looks really cool. And sometimes I download your shortcuts, but I don't know how to get started. And I don't know how to edit one of your shortcuts. Like, it is so daunting when I open one of your shortcuts. I just, I just take your word for it, but I don't know what to do inside of it. Now, obviously, that's a problem, right? Because you're basically here with the more advanced shortcuts, you're basically asking people to become programmers. And I think this is one of the areas where AI and natural language and a large language model could really help people make sense of what's possible to achieve with the Shortcuts app. My basic idea is that people should be able to issue a command in natural language to describe to Siri or Apple GPT, whatever it's going to be called, to describe what they want and get an output and get an actual shortcut in return. So, for example, I get this every week with Sylvia. Like, she has an idea. She's like, "Hey, how can I take my latest video and take the first 10 seconds of the video, make it a GIF, and send it over iMessage to somebody?" Now, when you describe it like that in plain English, it makes sense, right? You know what you're looking for. But how do you turn that spoken command, that intention, that description in plain English, in natural language, or in our case, in Italian, but you get my point. How do
Right.
you turn that into a series of steps? Now, this is obviously always been the issue with programming, right? How do you abstract human intention and make it into code? But with shortcuts and with a large language model, I think that's such a unique opportunity for Apple to take that idea and be like, okay, why don't you get started with shortcuts just by asking Siri what you're looking to build? And we're going to take care of matching your request with actions and logic and conditions from the Shortcuts app. And so that command, take my latest video, chop off the first 10 seconds, make it a GIF, become a series of 3-4 actions that you didn't need to manually connect in the Shortcuts editor, that you didn't have to, you don't have to deal with variables and passing input parameters. You just write it down or you just speak it, and you get a little piece of code that in this case is called the shortcut that you can use on the spot or you can reuse in the future. This, I think, this idea of prompt-based shortcuts should be the next big thing for Apple to onboard people with the Shortcuts app, and maybe also use it as a way to teach people how to code with shortcuts.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And, the reality is that companies like Zapier are already doing this, as you've talked about.
Yep.
I mean, you can sign up for a Zapier account and create your zaps using natural language. And it's not perfect, but it gets you far enough.
Gets you there, yes.
Right. It gets you far enough along the road that you can then, with a little research, a little trial and error, you can usually get to what you want. So I think that is the future of automation as well. And I'm excited to see it come someday to shortcuts as well. I'm just a little skeptical, I guess, as to when that might be.
Yeah, but I think there's such a huge opportunity here. You take a look, for example, at what ChatGPT is doing.
Yeah.
Like, you can go to ChatGPT and you can ask him, hey, I got this little piece of AppleScript, or I got this Python code, or I got this Objective-C code.
Yep.
How do I tweak it so that it does such and such? And not only does ChatGPT get you partially there, but it also explains what it's doing, right? And so I think that just like I would love to see a large language model applied to Swift Playgrounds or Xcode with a Copilot-like functionality, I think I would love to see the same, but for shortcuts. Imagine the old feature from Beats Music. Do you remember the sentence?
I remember the sentence, yeah.
Imagine that, but for shortcuts. Like, I want, and now obviously I understand, like, how could you abstract a shortcut as complex as Apple frames with a prompt? Like, at that point, you're just writing a novella to explain what you want to build. But for simpler shortcuts, which are the thing that people want to use on a regular basis, that could work. And so I think, I hope that's something that maybe we'll get it this year, maybe next year, but I hope that's something that Apple is planning.
Yeah, I hope so too. All right, Federico, let's cross all of our fingers and toes and hope for the best in 2024 with shortcuts. And I'm excited to see what Apple does with a lot of things this year, but I'm really going to be keeping a particularly close eye on shortcuts. I want to thank our 3 sponsors for this episode. That's Memberful, Jam, and Notion. You can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico is on Mastodon. Just go to vitici.macstories.net. I'm there too. Just go to johnvorhees.macstories.net. And you can find us on Threads and Instagram, where Federico is at Vitici. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.